Good morning and welcome to our broadcast. This morning we'll be in Psalm 20 if you want to find your place there. Psalm 120, Hope for the Homesick. One of my favorite hymns begins like this. Why should I feel discouraged, and why should the shadows come? Why should my heart be lonely and long for heaven and home? When Jesus is my portion, my constant friend is he. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. That is a timeless song, and that may be one of your favorites also. It's a timeless song, but I think it speaks really well to the times in which we live right now. There are a lot of us who are feeling lonely and longing for heaven and home. For the most part, we are stuck at home, and we miss those places that we used to be able to go. There's a strange dynamic that I thought about this week. We are stuck at home, but we're sick of home. And so at the same time, we're sick of being home, but we're homesick. It's not so much that we are separated from our homes, we are stuck at home, but what we are homesick for is just the normal life that we lived up until about a month ago. We miss all those places that we used to go, the barbershop, the coffee shop, the tire shop. We miss those things, the hardware store, the movies, all of those normal things. We miss that simple act of just being able to go out and eat dinner with friends out at a restaurant. And life will return to normal soon, we hope. But right now, we're homesick because life is upside down. We are not the first people to have ever experienced this. It's just not the ordinary for us, and it's hard. So how do we make our way through it? If you were an extrovert before all of this, if you found your energy and joy from being around other people, this is especially hard for you at this time. You are homesick not for your house, but you are homesick for the community of living with other people and the joy that you derive from them. This is hard. Joshua Klapow is a psychologist and a professor at the University of Alabama in Birmingham. And here's what he said about homesickness. Homesickness has everything to do with attachment. When we feel homesick, we feel insecure or uncomfortable with where we are physically or emotionally. We're longing for something that in our minds is known and predictable and consistent and stable. A person can have a less than ideal home life, struggling with poverty or violence or other challenges, but still feel homesick after arriving at a beautiful, peaceful college campus. And so what we find, what the experts tell us about homesickness, is that being homesick is not about the place where you sleep and get your mail. Homesickness is about more than that. It's about routine and emotion and connections. And if even the life that you knew before was not amazing, still that shift to something else and different can make you homesick for where you were and what you had before. It's not just a place, it's an experience. And so once again, obviously, I'm broadcasting from an empty sanctuary this morning. We are not in our home collectively as a church family. We are all scattered once again individually to our homes. I'm homesick for this place. I miss the sound of little kids running through here. I miss the sound of conversations going on in that lobby as we come into church in the morning. I miss this place being full of joy and music and people. I'm homesick for it. Even though I'm at my house, I'm still homesick. And I think that resonates with us today. What we find in Psalm 120 is the same thing. As God's people, when we can't be gathered together, we should feel homesick. This is not natural for us to be separated like this for an extended period of time. We find echoes of this situation in the Psalms. And just as a general reminder, what we find in the Psalms is this incredible range of human experience. There is sadness and joy, there's war and peace, there's comfort, there's worship and worry. There are all of these things. There's incredible communion with God, there's peace with God, and there's also silence from God. And there's the accusation that God doesn't hear. There's joy of worship, and there's hot tears of grief, and everything in between. So basically, whatever you are feeling, you can find echoes of it in Psalms and how God's people dealt with these things before. Remember, we are not the first to go through hard times. There is a particular section of Psalms that begins in Psalm 120 with our text this morning. And collectively, they're called the Psalms of Ascent. In other words, to go up. And there are a lot of different theories on where they got this idea of ascent. Why are they called that? And I think that, as it usually is, the most simple explanation is the best one. So basically, wherever you were in the nation of Israel, you had to go up to Jerusalem. It wasn't the absolute highest place in elevation in the entire nation, but for the most part it was. Almost everybody in the nation, if you went to Jerusalem, you were going up. You were gaining elevation from wherever you had come from. And so in these several times a year when the people had to go from where they lived in their own towns and villages up to Jerusalem for these feast days and these worship days to the tabernacle in Jerusalem, wherever they came from, they were going up. And so the songs of ascents, they were a gathered group of psalms that as the people would go up together from their places to their places of worship, they would sing these. And they were part of the religious life of Israel. And as one writer pointed out this week, that even Jesus with his family, these psalms would have been part of his youth and his upbringing. They would travel together. And on a lighter note, just for a second this morning, I don't know what this would have sounded like in Hebrew, but just people being people, and especially kids being kids, even across all these generations and all of this distance. I just wonder what it would have sounded like in Hebrew for all of the little kids to say, "How long till we get there, and can't I have a snack?" These are universal experiences of people who are traveling, the people who are waiting to worship. And again, I find so many connections here. These are worship songs, but they're worship in waiting as they are traveling to get to the place where they will go. In Psalm 120, in verse 1, there is a cry of distress. Psalm 120 in verse 1, "In my distress I called out to the Lord, and he answered me." In my distress, called out to the Lord. This is such a simple point, but it's one that I want us to hang on to and remember this morning. We are not the first generation of God's people to go through difficult times. We are not unique in this. These are unique situations to our lives, but we're not the first generation of Americans to live through a pandemic. It's not happened in our lifetime. But we're not the first generation of Americans to go through difficult times. We're not the first ones to go to the store to buy something that we need and find the shelves empty of that thing. That's not a unique experience to us. We're not the first ones to be distanced and to have to live in isolation. The history of humanity is a history of suffering, and God's people are not exempt from that just because we are God's people. The question is, and the distinction is, what do we do in our distress? What is our response to distress? You could call to God, or you could go into despair. Psalmist makes the choice that we all must make in our distress, is to not to sink into despair, but to cry out to the God who knows and cares. In a New Testament light, as Paul wrote to the Thessalonians in writing about grief and loss and the second coming of Jesus, he said to them in chapter 4, "We do not want you to grieve like those who have no hope." He didn't forbid grief. Grief is a natural response to difficulty, but grief is different than outright despair. The psalmist says in Psalm 120 verse 1, "In my distress," we can't make the distress go away. You can't just magically snap your fingers or say some magic words and make the difficulty disappear. It doesn't work that way. What do you do with your distress? You could sink into despair, or you could cry out to God. As David wrote, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." As David was in that valley of distress, he couldn't change the circumstances, but he cried out to the God that he knew would know and care. So there's the cry of distress. Psalm 120 in verse 2, there's a call for deliverance. He not only just voices to God, but he cries out to God, "God, actively deliver me from this." Psalm 120 in verse 2, "Deliver me, O Lord, from lying lips and from a deceitful tongue. What shall be given to you, and what more shall be done to you, you deceitful tongue? A warrior's sharp arrows with glowing coals of the broom tree." So if you think about this, the psalmist is on his way to worship, but he's still got all of this baggage. And his difficulty here is not war or a pandemic. It is people who are actively trying to hurt him with their words, lying about him, oppressing him, distressing him. Deliver me from lying lips and from a deceitful tongue. He just wants to worship. He just wants to live and go about his life, but there is something, a situation that is distressing him. And regardless of the difficulty, he can't fix the problem. So he looks to God for deliverance. Ultimately, what is the deliverance for our present difficulty here? We're distancing. We hope that there will be a vaccine. We need testing. All of these things that are physical solutions to this very physical present problem. And if it weren't this, it would be something else. If we went back to the way things were before, we would still have problems. You weren't worried about this a year ago, but you were worried about something. The human experience is that we have struggles and problems. What is the answer that transcends this present difficulty? We got to fix this. We got to move through this situation. We got to see what's on the other side of this. We have to restart life at some point. But what do we do on the other side of that? What is the point of all of this? Well, the simple fact of the matter is that we all have temporary problems. This is a huge temporary problem that we have to find a solution to. But we all have an eternal problem as well. And regardless of what temporary problems we face, there is an eternal problem that faces all of us, which is we are eternal beings that live for a time in a temporary body. And so the clock is going to run out on our physical bodies. And our greatest physical problem will someday be this life is not eternal in this body. So what comes next? After the next crisis, then what? If we make it through this, then what? Ultimately, we all have to be prepared to step into eternity. What is the ultimate deliverance from this life? There is eternal life. And that either gives distress or that gives great hope and comfort, depending on where you are with God and where you find your peace in all of this. What is the deliverance of God in this? I would love for God to miraculously swoop in and just fix all of this so that life could instantly go back to normal tomorrow. But we wait. We wait. We wait with hope. We do not wait alone. Even as we're scattered, we wait for the God who loves us and the God who sent his Son to die for us, to be raised again, to conquer death, so that through this, through anything, we have confidence in the God who hears and ultimately delivers. Now, the third thing in this text, before we go to a New Testament perspective, Psalm 120 and verse 5, "Woe to me that I sojourn in Homesick, and that I dwell among the tents of Kedar. Too long I've had my dwelling among those who hate peace. I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war." It says, "Woe to me." It's not a term that we use very much, but I think we feel it. Woe is me. That's the ancient Old Testament psalm of lament. It's a deep sorrow. Woe to me. Woe to me. There are two places mentioned in verse 5, Meshach and Kedar. Now, I'm no ancient archaeological or geographical expert. From what I understand, though, these two places are at the opposite ends of Israel. One of them is at the very far north, the other one is the very far south in the wilderness. One in the northern mountains, the other in the southern wilderness. Home to nomadic people who had really no fixed home, but their homes were far away from the Jerusalem that this author knows and loves. It's not his destination. It's not the place of worship. It's not the place where they're going to meet Jehovah God. He says, I sojourn there. Also not a word that we use a lot, but sojourn is to travel and to live temporarily in a place that's not your home. He says, I've been displaced, and my home, my temporary home, has been in Meshach and Kedar. I've been far away from home, and I'm living with nomadic people who are not my people. I've had my dwelling there, but it's not my home. In other words, I'm homesick. I'm not where I belong. Everything is upside down. I'm not sure that he ever left home. And the reason why I say that is it would be really hard to have your home in Meshach and Kedar at the same time. Impossible. But they are places that represent about as far away from the known world of Israel as you could get at that time. They are at the extremes. But the thing that they have in common is they're not home. He is homesick. And the reason is that he is surrounded by people who don't share his values. He is for peace, but they are for war. And even in his own home, he feels like his home doesn't exist anymore because he barely knows the people who should view all of this differently than he does. Everything is upside down. Remember what I said before. Homesickness is not necessarily that you are not in the same brick and mortar place where you normally get your mail. It is an upsetting of the normal life and routine. He had not changed, but the people around him had changed, and it caused him to suffer. If you notice what we don't have in Psalm 120, what we don't have is resolution. And just to contrast it, you can look at this later, but Psalm 73 is one of my favorites. And it's a great example of a psalm that follows the whole ebb and flow. Psalm 73 begins with the high statement of the goodness of God and things that the author knows about God. But then there is this low point in that psalm, sort of this ebb or valley. And so you go from the statement of this is the truth, this is what I know about God, God is good and God has been good to me, but there's this low experience, and so many of the Psalms follow the same track. God is great, God is good, and then boom, life happens, and we bottom out, and there's struggling and difficulty in the valley of the shadow of death, and everything is awful. And then we cry out to God, and then we find ourselves back up again. And so many of the Psalms start here on one mountain, they fall off in this valley of despair, and then by the end of that, you're back on top again, and you're singing praises about the goodness of God, and the Psalms capture that full ebb and flow of life. But if you notice in Psalm 120, we don't have that. It just ends. It just ends. I am for peace, they are for war. Boom, end of story. Homesick, even in my own home. There is no resolution here. That psychologist that we began by quoting this morning, that psychologist and professor from Alabama, he said that the symptoms of homesickness are often the same as the symptoms of grief. There is sadness and anxiety. Your normal patterns are interrupted. You sleep too much or you don't sleep enough. You eat too much or you don't eat enough. Probably most of us are stuck at home eating too much right now, but that's another sermon for another time, right? In the past few weeks, maybe your sleep schedule has been disrupted. Maybe you suffer from insomnia or nightmares, and if that's you, I want you to know that you're not alone. Maybe you went into this crisis and you were already not on a great footing of emotional health. This has only made it worse. You would love to go back to the way things were before, even though the way things were before were not great. And if that's you, I see you. I see you. I care for you. So what do? We've seen the Old Testament perspective. In Psalm 120, even though it is a psalm of ascents and we're headed to the place of worship, there's still a lot of worry and baggage, and it just sort of ends. And so I don't want to leave this here without a New Testament perspective on this. It struck me as I was preparing this yesterday that here I am writing about homesickness and the way things used to be and wanting to be back to normal. And I realized that I'm in a perfectly comfortable house. I could hear my kids playing in their bedroom. There was a cat sleeping comfortably on the couch. I had jazz in my AirPods. I had ribs on the smoker. I mean, a lot of people in our own state, a lot of people in our own community are enduring this same thing with much worse circumstances. One of my missionary pastor friends is in Russia, and the national standards there have it to where they can only go 100 meters from their home if they don't have some sort of special reason or excuse, and they're tracked on their mobile devices. 100 meters, that's all the freedom they have right now. And so I was reminded of Jesus in this. And in Hebrews 12, verses 2 and 3, as we read about Christ, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, that you will not grow weary and lose heart. And so as we listen this morning, as you tune in or dial in, however you found us this morning, you are more or less stuck at home. And as I was reminded from Hebrews 12 that whatever we face, we should fix our eyes on Jesus as we travel through this. I was reminded from this episode from the life of Jesus. In Matthew 8, a man comes up to Jesus and he mentions following him. And Jesus said to the man, this is Matthew 8 and verse 20, "Foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." In other words, Jesus was homeless. Jesus was homeless. Now, everybody is from somewhere, right? Everybody has some hometown. Maybe it wasn't great. Maybe you're not proud of it. Maybe you lie about it, but you've got some place that was home to you. Maybe you're stuck there now and you're not happy about it, but you've got a home. Jesus had no home. And that was true, I think, in a couple of senses. One was the very literal sense that he was traveling throughout his public ministry. He had no home. He had no residence. He had no place to get his mail as we know it. He had no deed to property that he owned. His life was to travel around and minister to God's people. That was his mission. He had no home. But he did have a place where he grew up back in Nazareth. But he couldn't go back there because God's will, God's plan, God's mission had called him away from that and prevented him from going back. Jesus was, in a lot of ways, homeless. He was uprooted. If you are in a season of life right now, and maybe it's not a season, maybe it is a permanent situation, that you can't go back to the place that you know and love, you have a friend in Jesus who understands, who experienced that same thing, who sees you and knows that experience. And so from that thought in Hebrews, I want to bring us to three thoughts about Jesus this morning as we sort of move toward a conclusion here. And with those thoughts of Psalm 120 in our mind of crying out to God, and while we are waiting for worship, what do we do in the meantime with our distress? We fix our eyes on Jesus. So what did Jesus do? What did he experience? Well, for one, we understand that Jesus suffered not in the same way that we do, because Jesus suffered and it was personal. In Hebrews 12, we see that he endured the cross, scorning its shame, enduring such opposition from sinful men. This present difficulty that we face right now, the reason that we're not here right now in this building, this virus, this pandemic, it's not personal. It impacts all of us personally. It may have impacted you much more personally than it has impacted me. But in general, it is not a personal thing. This virus is not out to get you. We mentioned mental health this morning. If you think that this virus is specifically out to get you, then you probably do need to sit down with somebody. This virus is not personal, even though we are all personally impacted by it. And I say that to get to this. Personal suffering is more difficult. If you're going through something that's more generalized and everybody goes through it, if you are going through something that is just the fate of people in general, then that's hard. But if somebody has hurt you personally, if it's something about you that they attack because it's you, that is specifically painful. That's harmful. But that's what Jesus endured. The difficulty that he endured was not general. It wasn't what everybody faced. It was personal for him and therefore more difficult. Jesus suffered because he was innocent. Because he was innocent. He deserved nothing that he endured in this life. So let me tread carefully just for a second here, but this is a sobering statement, but just hang on with me just for a second. None of us are too good to suffer. None of us are too good to get this virus. None of us are too good to die. Because those are just general things that happen to everybody. And you could live as good and moral life as possible, but you will still face the end of your life. None of us are innocent. Some people, sure, some people are better than other people. Yes, there are people that I would trust with my wallet and some people that I would not. None of us are innocent, though. But Jesus was innocent in everything that he suffered. Jesus deserved none of it. I'm not saying that anyone deserves this virus, but none of us are innocent. the difficulties that we go through in this life, even death itself, none of us are innocent. None of us are completely worthy of standing before God, but Jesus was. He deserved nothing from what he went through. It's only by the grace of God that we can enjoy this life. It's only through the grace of God that we can have hope for the next life. Also, Jesus suffered with purpose. He suffered all the indignities of life on this earth, but he did it for a reason. Hebrews says, for the joy that was set before him, for the joy beyond the cross, the joy of being reunited with his Father, the joy of accomplishing our redemption, that joy, that future joy, led him through that present difficulty. In Psalm 120, as the psalmist was going up to Jerusalem to worship, that future joy of being there with God led him and led all those travelers through the difficulties of climbing that mountain and whatever they had left behind because of the joy that lied before them. Jesus suffered and he lived with purpose. We are confined now. Most of us are confined to our homes, and we're confined and constrained away from things that we used to know and love to do, things that we can't experience. So think about just for a moment how much Jesus was confined in his body. Before, he was not limited by time or space. And then he wakes in Bethlehem. He is confined in this tiny, helpless human body and wrapped in swaddling clothes, unable to move. Jesus is in his early to mid-30s at this point. Lifespans were a lot shorter. In his time, Jesus had lived a life of manual labor before beginning his public ministry. And it struck me this week that Jesus probably physically was at that time of life to where when he woke up in the morning, he's hurting somewhere. He was constrained and confined. He lived a life of difficulty. And it was that future glory, that future purpose, the purpose of your redemption and mine, that brought him through all of that. And ultimately, as we saw last week, he was confined by nails on a cross and confined by a tomb that could not hold him. But Jesus lived a life of constraint and confinement, but he did it with purpose, and he did it with an eye toward future glory. And so we can do the same. We can endure with purpose. That section of Psalms, the Psalm of Ascents, they point us up and they point us through difficulties. If you've ever climbed a mountain, it's hard. That gain in elevation is worth it. Your legs burn, your lungs burn, the air gets thin. But when you get to the top, there is nothing like it. And it is worth every step. And someday from the child of God, when we do climb that mountain and we're there because of the grace of God and we finish all things and we realize that because of the grace and mercy of God that we are with him, the sufferings of this world will be forgotten and left behind, and we will only be overwhelmed with the beauty and presence of God. So what do? I hope that all this is over soon. I pray for a vaccine and treatment, and that all of this is successful and that we can very quickly resume life with minimal impact long term. But today, there are a lot of families in America that are grieving. And so we live with this distance and difficulty. Until then, let us live with endurance, and let us fix our eyes on Jesus, and let us live with glory in our eyes until we see his wonderful face. May the Lord bless you and keep you until we are together again. Amen.